Hello, my name is Melissa Selden, and I'm a Research and Reader Services librarian at the Reading Public Library in Reading, Massachusetts. Welcome to an evening with author Arkady Martine. First of
Hi.
all, I would like to thank the Wilmington Memorial Library, Worcester Public Library, and Somerville Public Library for co-hosting this evening and making it possible to bring this event to a wider audience. Thank you all so much. I also want to thank White Limb Books, Reading's local bookstore, and Comically Speaking, the local comic book shop here in Reading, for their help in promoting the event. We'll put their links in the links to their websites in the chat, and I definitely encourage you all to check them out and support two amazing local businesses the next time you find yourselves in need of books, comics, games, and more. And now I would like to introduce author Arkady Martine. Arkady Martine won the 2020 Hugo Award for the Best Novel for her debut novel, A Memory Called Empire. The sequel, A Desolation Called Peace, was just released on March 2nd. As Dr. Anna Linden Weller, she is a historian of the Byzantine Empire and a city planner. She is currently a policy advisor for the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where she works on climate change mitigation, energy grid modernization, and resiliency planning. Under both of her names, she writes about border politics, rhetoric, propaganda, and the edges of the world. Hi, Arkady, and welcome to this virtual public library, Reading Public Library event, and thank you so much for
Hi.
coming.
Thank you for having me. I'm incredibly happy to be here.
Yay! And we're definitely happy that you could make it all the way from New Mexico, no less.
Well, merits of virtual events. I mean,
Indeed. All right. So as we get started, I know that when basically before I took an English class about science fiction, I really didn't know what it was. So I thought, I know a lot of people here are science fiction fans, but I thought that maybe we could start by talking about what is science fiction anyway?
oh my God, it's such a big question that's actually really fun. Let me see. Where do you even start with that? So first of all, I want to kind of draw a distinction between what I'm going to talk about, which is science fiction in the Anglophone tradition, so the Western English speaking world. And this is certainly not the only tradition of what we could call science fiction. But being a person from a Western country whose native language is English and who mostly reads in English and definitely only writes in English, that's what I feel like I can talk about. But there's a giant universe of other stuff that I'm gonna not talk about, and that's a shame. But okay, so there's this really old, I don't know, canard of saying science fiction is the literature of ideas, which I think probably emerged during the 1950s, which sometimes is called the Silver Age of science fiction. The golden age being the 30s and the pulps, where you've got like Astounding magazine, and all of those, which were sold like for a dime in newsstands, sort of like comics were up until very recently. But the literature of ideas concept kind of comes from this obsession with technology, which goes with the time period that we're really referring to. So late 40s, early 50s, we have the Cold War, the aftermath of World War II, the atomic bomb, sudden modernization of energy and access to machinery. So think about the difference between having your own washing machine or access to a washing machine and not. If you are someone who had to take care of a household, which was mostly women, but not all women and not all people who did that were women, in the 50s, suddenly there was this mechanization of work. So machinery transforming society in a really deep and important and true way. And one of the things that emerged out of that was this sort of equation of technology with progress, that there would be this endless upward staircase of a new technology will transform society, everything will be better. This gets very rapidly deconstructed, which is a good thing. But some of the early famous science fiction has this idea that they're about a technological concept or idea. The story is really about exploring what that technology will do, what it will accomplish. It's not very much about individual characters or their emotions, or there might be some political allegory in there because we've got a lot of Cold War stuff going on, but it's not really about their politics. And your heroes are scientists, and they tend to be young, white, male scientists, and they go to space, and it's great. And then all of that gets, that's a stage set that I think those of us who write and read science fiction have been playing with, taking apart and putting back together ever since. I don't really love the concept of science fiction as being only about technology, unless you get really wide about what technology is. And you can go to the origins of the word technology, which is actually the Greek word techne. And that is also the word that you use for art or for craft. So a process, a making. And if you widen technology to encompass, say, demographics or propaganda and rhetoric or elections, social science, but also art. When you think about technology in these ways, that's why I write science fiction. It is a literature of ideas for me, but it's a literature of ideas about society, not just or only a literature of ideas about science, though science is great and can be a really big part of it. That's kind of, I don't know, the first 15 minutes of an intro lecture. I'm sorry.
No, that's very interesting and wonderful, and definitely, the literature of ideas, I think, is definitely a good place to start, especially, if someone is like, what is this science fiction thing anyway? And sort of, building off of that, you know, let's talk about some reasons why people who might not necessarily have that background or that knowledge, why they might be intimidated by it and by picking up a science fiction novel, because they're like, oh, it's science fiction.
Yeah, well, I think intimidated is often not what you run into. Dismissive is the one that I usually run into. It's literature for kids. It's escapism. It's just like novelizations of video games. And by the way, novelizations of video games could be amazing. But I think we are still, and it is not just on the side of people who write what you can call literary fiction. It is definitely on the side of people who write what you call genre fiction as well. We're both very mad at each other all the time, and it's kind of ridiculous. The traditional science fiction is just for emotionally stunted boys, and nothing there's no like real depth to it. It's all escapist and ridiculous. And then from the genre writer side, and I hear this all the time, oh, literary fiction is all about English professors committing adultery. Nothing ever happens, and it's incredibly boring. In my opinion, if that's what you're reading, you're not reading widely enough in either genre.
Yeah. So that's definitely something that I've come across too, with the dismissiveness as well as intimidation. And so what are some of your recommendations for someone who might be interested, for their first science fiction novel if they've never read it before?
That's a really interesting question, because it kind of depends on what this person likes to read when they're not reading science fiction. Because, and this is one of my favorite things about science fiction, is that you can find a science fiction novel that hits any genre that you love and is going to feel like that to you. I mean, I have recommended my own work to people who love spy novels, John le Carré. Like there's a lot of continuity there. And that's because he's a big influence on me as a writer and someone whose work I really admire and am interested in. But if what you're interested in is a kind of action-y, military thriller-y kind of thing, I'd point you at John Scalzi at Old Man's War. If what you love is romance, I'd point you at a book that just came out from Tor like 2 months ago, 1 month ago, Winter's Orbit. If you want to read something that is deeply intellectually and spiritually challenging, but still has a kind of propulsive storytelling to it, I'd point you at Gene Wolfe. Start with the omnibus Shadow and Claw, which is this absolutely nuts. He does things with language that I can only aspire to, but it's also really about Catholicism, kinda. So there's something for everybody depending on what you want. And that's one of the beautiful things about science fiction as a toolbox, is that you can create a lens of hyperfocus on whatever you, and in this case it's you, the author, really want to explore, really want to shine a very precise spotlight on. Because what science fiction does is it lets you take a concept like, I don't know, a robot, the idea of a robot that's sentient instead of like your Roomba. I mean, I'm not so sure about some Roombas. Some of them seem at least as sentient as some cats. And you want to just think about, well, what would that mean? What is the relationship between humans and the servants we create? That is kind of what Isaac Asimov was doing with all of the Susan Calvin stories from that golden silver age. And lots of other people have gone much farther and in different directions than that. But it's that precise spotlight on an idea. And that idea doesn't have to be a technology. That idea can be, I mean, this is a fantasy novel, but I kind of lump them together. There's a book by Guy Gavriel Kay called Tigana. It's a fantasy novel. It's one of my favorite books. And that book is about nationalism and what remains to you when you lose your country. And it's also a fantasy novel. And also it's like about music, which I also love, but that's the concept at the heart of it. And it is played out through a fantastical, not realistic, quote unquote, way of looking at it. In Tigana, the people who've lost their country literally can't remember its name because of a spell. And it makes real an idea. And that's kind of the magic of this particular sort of genre fiction.
Yeah, that's something that I really enjoy too, is the sort of, taking something, removing it, putting it in a different setting and like looking at it from different angles sort of, and deconstructing it. And I have to say, I also, my elevator pitch for a memory called Empire is a political spy thriller on a different planet. So
this is correct. There is nothing about that statement that is wrong.
Yeah.
My then publicist, like I have a lovely new publicist, but my old publicist switched companies. Used to pitch it as House of Cards in Space, and I still think that's really good.
Definitely. And so what we've talked, I feel like we've covered this a little bit, but more specifically, what draws you personally to both read and then to write science fiction?
Well, it's something I inherited. My dad is a big science fiction reader. And I mean, I'm the sort of person, and I was the sort of child who would read anything that wasn't tied down and some things that were. So what was around for me to pick up was science fiction in a lot of ways. It was also something that I shared with my dad. He gave me Dune. He gave me Foundation, like these important classics of the genre, because they were things that he enjoyed. And then there were all of these short stories, Zelazny short stories that were just around, and I picked them up not knowing anything and absorbed a lot that way. But as a reader, I think I gravitated towards science fiction and fantasy in part because it took me a while to be old enough to want to be in the world I'm in. Like as a kid and a young adult, I was more interested in edge cases than I was in expressions of life as it is. And science fiction would give me edge cases more often than not. As a writer, I've discovered that I write science fiction unless I'm trying really hard not to. It is the natural mode. I can write other genres. I have written fantasy and published it. I have written a lot of academia and published some of it. I write policy papers now, and those are really not very science fictional at all, mostly. Um, but it's a very difficult thing for me to come up with an idea or a theme or a question that I want to write about and not do that sharp spotlight. What if we take it to its extreme? How can I display this? So it's just what I write, and I love it. I write a lot of different kinds of it. The Tixcalan books are, people call them space opera, which is a better genre classification than many others, but still incorrect. I don't know what they are. They're political science fiction for me, but that's not really it's not a marketing category. So like you can't stick that on an end cap in a bookstore. But I write things that you'd read more as cyberpunk. I write things that are much more lyrical in some ways. Yes, I can get worse than I already am in these books. Right now, I'm finishing up a novella, which is a locked room mystery about an AI. And my next book project is about arson and water rights in a sort of medium future Los Angeles. So, but the novella about the locked room mystery is about what are haunted houses really? Like what does it mean to be haunted by a place? And the water rights book is really about what does a city need? What is resource control? And who will do it? And how far will they go? And to really play with those things, I always want to put them somewhere where I can turn all the dials up to 11. So that's why I gravitate towards science fiction.
Yeah, and you do it very well. So I know I and many other people are very appreciative. And hey, maybe a political science fiction will be an end cap at bookstores in the future.
I could give you a list.
Yeah, I was like, there's a lot of science fiction is very political.
I think science fiction is often really political. And that can be both, I mean, there's a political science fiction for every variant of politics, including some I find personally distasteful and or immoral. But it is a genre that lends itself to thinking about politics because it lends itself to thinking about society.
Speaking of your writing and society, I think we should talk a little bit about a memory called Empire, because I know I know a lot of the people who are here tonight have probably read it, and I know that there are some people here who haven't yet and are probably, if they don't have reasons to read it already, are looking for some. So can you tell us a little bit about A Memory Called Empire?
Yeah. So A Memory Called Empire is about the ambassador from a small space station on the edge of a really big empire that is a expansive, universalist, culturally hungry place. And she is meant to be, her name is Mahit Dismar, and she is meant to be the new ambassador from her space station to the center of the empire. And she's awfully young for the job, by which I mean she's probably in her late 20s or the space equivalent thereof. But the guy who used to have her job has mysteriously disappeared. So she is summoned to fix that, maybe? She doesn't know why. And she lands in a whole bunch of nasty political trouble. And there's a succession crisis, there's an impending war, there's the fact that the empire of Texcalan, this big empire that her space station is right at the edge of, is maybe going to militarily annex her home. And she wants to stop that from happening. Except she has this deep-seated admiration for Texcalan because she grew up reading about it, grew up reading their literature, she speaks their language, she admires Texcalan. Immersing herself in that culture makes her happy. Except the Texcalan Litzlim don't think of anyone who isn't one of them as a real person. So in a lot of ways, the book is about, I call it, it's the book about what do you do if the culture you love is devouring yours? And it is, in that sense, an extremely political book. It's also got mind sharing and some big questions about institutional memory and how one should or shouldn't keep track of it. And I'm trying not to spoil anything, but it's difficult. So it's set in some very far future. People keep asking me, either in events or sometimes on Twitter, about whether like there's an Earth somewhere. Like, is this a future history that you could draw a line from now to? And my answer is, I don't know. It doesn't matter. If there is a single origin point for human expansion in the universe that I created, it was so long ago, no one remembers where it was. And there have been multiple single point expansions outward since that original one. So maybe there is an Earth. One of the reasons that it's so far separated is that I really did want to work with some pretty deep and nasty topics like imperialism and assimilation and loss, and not have it be a direct commentary on any one thing. It's a commentary in general. And I'm making it sound like a textbook, and it's really not. I swear it's entertaining. There's a poetry contest that might not help. There's a poetry contest that's functionally a rap battle that might help.
Yeah, I've also said that there is a weaponized poetry in this book.
Yes, that would be accurate.
Yeah.
It's something that I borrowed wholesale from one of the influences that I built the Empire of Texcalan out of, which is the medieval Byzantine Empire, which is what I got my PhD in studying. So the poetry contests are real. They are all things that actually happened at the Byzantine court. I mean, not these specific ones, but the concept thereof it's all real. And that was really fun to play with.
That's another thing I wanted to touch on, is just everything about your world building that's all woven together is just very rich. And when I was reading it, I found it to be very believable. There was never a point where I was like, oh, that couldn't have happened. So yeah, So you drew on your historian self, and I have a feeling with a lot of the sort of infrastructure and whatnot that's present, maybe you've drawn a bit on your city planner self.
Yep. And also the fact that I'm a New Yorker, no matter where I live. I'm from Manhattan. I was born there. I grew up there. I really love cities. I'm kind of obsessed. And so I built this world out of a lot of pieces. It's meant to be nothing specific, but there's a ton of Byzantine and Armenian history in it. There's a lot of influence from my research on the Aztecs, the Mexica, and there's a bunch of thinking about American imperialism, especially American cultural imperialism, the idea of there being a McDonald's in every country, like, and that being ideal in a lot of places, like wanting American culture, whether or not it's a good thing. And also, I built a lot of it out of, I'm fascinated by algorithms in cities and how panopticon eyes work and the relationship between policing and safety, which is not a one-to-one thing at all. So all of that goes in there. Everything I get fascinated by, I tend to use in some way.
And I also want to give a little shout out to the food in particular. That's like, I have a soft spot for genre fiction and food present there. And in a lot of science fiction books,
They forget about
you
it.
get like,
But food is so important. Food is so important culturally. And so almost all of the food in A Memory Called Empire is real. Almost all. There's one thing that isn't, and that's only because I don't think we have an edible flower big enough that exists. But everything else is actually a dish I have had somewhere. And I spent a lot of time on the food culture, actually, because one of the things that I wanted the Teixcatlanli Empire to feel like was someplace that was really rich, and not just rich in wealth, but rich in experience, like extravagance as normal. And because that draws this contrast with where the protagonist, Mahit, comes from. She's from a space station. It's got 30,000 people on it, and that's about all it can handle. You have more people than that, there aren't enough resources. Most of her food comes from vats. It may taste good. In fact, a lot of it does, but it came from a vat. So I wanted to draw a really sharp contrast. And also, I love describing food, clothing, architecture, visuals. I love that sense of creating a world through what do people see every day? What do people eat every day? How do people move through the world? What is important? And also, it's really fun to think of, okay, so if they have an ice cream, could they have avocado ice cream? And what if I want to say avocado ice cream without ever mentioning the word avocado? Can I do it? And I don't know if it worked, but I tried.
yeah, it's yeah, the part with the ice cream is a favorite of mine personally, because it's like, God, any world with ice cream is
Well, yeah. I mean, if you
good.
have something that creates a lipid-filled liquid, you're probably going to freeze it at some point, which means you probably are going to invent ice cream at some point. And I like ice cream. It ended up being avocado ice cream because I couldn't convince my wife that olive oil ice cream actually would taste good, even though she is wrong.
I'd try it.
Yeah.
And just one more thing about the world building, which I feel like layers a bunch of these together. Because you're talking about the visuals and the city and the infrastructure, and there's a part in A Memory Called Empire when Mahit first arrives, and Three Seagrass is reciting a poem about the buildings of the city while they're traveling through the city.
Yes.
And it's just, it works on the page, it works as like a mental visual.
I really enjoyed doing that. It's again kind of a callback to Byzantium in general, because like the descriptions of the city, like the kind of ekphrasis, where you write something that describes a visual. But I also thought of it as like a memory aid. Like if you needed to give tours, and my I have family members who've worked as tour guides briefly, and how do you remember all of the dates? How do you remember the path? It becomes a rhythm, a retelling. You find yourself saying the same things each time you do it. I mean, my experience of this is when I taught undergraduate courses, and taught the same course more than once. Like, wait, I said that phrase last semester, but it's still really good. And also, poetry is how you remember a long sequence. If you think about the Iliad, Homer, that is from oral tradition. That is something that was done extemporaneously, just a guy standing up and reciting it. And to be able to remember it, you need the rhythm, you need the poetry.
Yeah, that's a really striking part of the book. And we've talked a little bit about the sort of subjects that you're interested in that sort of got discussed, so to speak, within a memory called Empire, such as, surveillance and the neutrality or non-neutrality of algorithms, and the relationship between a sort of dominant culture that sees itself as legitimate and, another culture that is trying to maintain its independence and identity, and then how that can get complicated, like in the case of Mahit, who admires the Texcolanli culture. And so when you were writing, were these ideas that you were consciously like, I'm going to write a book about these things, or did they sort of like come up as you went?
Horribly, yes. So I'm a theme first writer. I start with a question. And my question for a memory called Empire was, what do you do if you're in love with a culture that is eating your culture? And everything spun out from that. The algorithm stuff and the surveillance culture stuff was, I think, something that I got from living in the world between the years 2015 and 2017, which is when I was really writing the book. And I was thinking about it a lot, so it showed up in what I was making. I'm still thinking about it a lot, so it still keeps showing up. But I do start with these thematic questions, and it's kind of the way in for me, because then I know what the story should feel like, and I know what the arc is. I have to have answered the question in some way. It doesn't have to be like a definitive answer, and it's not for a memory called Empire. There's an answer, but it's not definitive. It's sort of open-ended, which I struggled with a little bit while I was writing it, deciding what I wanted that answer to be. But I knew that to end the book, I needed to answer that question. So everything else falls into the shape of that pattern. And I mean, the similar question for the sequel, A Desolation Called Peace, is what actually is a person anyway? How far out can you go? And secondarily, are there other ways of dealing with things that are so deeply threatening that you feel like you can't exist other than trying to kill them and make them stop? And this, A Desolation Called Peace, has a more definitive answer to both of those questions than A Memory Called Empire does, mostly because I think I have a more definitive answer. One that I feel like has a moral weight that I can stand behind, that I meant it when I put it there.
Yeah, and speaking of both books and sort of themes that connect them, I know we've talked a bit about the poetry, but in both books, the power of language and a poetry And I don't want to say too much about Desolation Called Peace because I know a lot of people haven't got to read it yet.
There's a lot about language in it. There's a lot of, wow, I really am a linguistics nerd. How much linguistics nerdery can I legitimately allow my characters to know? More than you think, less than I'd like is the answer to that one. But it is really a great deal about how do people communicate, in what ways, and what kind of mediation is between two people trying to communicate with each other. Whether that's they're not sharing a common language or a common understanding of a shared language, or what language is. Sometimes that is also a problem.
I just, while reading A Desolation Called Peace after having read A Memory Called Empire, I found a lot of parallels between sort of disconnect sometimes in Mahit communicating with the Tex-Kalanli people, and then some disconnects that happen with communication.
I will just say that those patterns are deliberate.
Yeah. So yeah, it was just a really fun through line for me to be like, oh, it continues. Yeah, and speaking of it, I've been throwing out some names like Mahit and Three Seagrass. I'd really love to talk about the characters in A Memory Called Empire, because that, they, as soon as Three Seagrass, Mahit, and 12 Azalea were like on the page together, I was like, I love these three. I love their relationship, even though they don't know if they can trust each other. And I just, want to talk about them a little bit.
So Mahit very rapidly acquires two sort of friends. One of them is Three Seagrass, who is assigned to her as kind of her guide, which is a political attaché, essentially. And 12 Azalea, who is basically Three Seagrass's old grad school buddy, who has discovered some entertaining political trouble and wants other people to get into it with him. I knew from the beginning that Three Seagrass would be a character. I had her very, very early. I mean, she appears in the first chapter of the book, but she was a very early role that I had created for Mahit to interact with. But 12 Azalea was a surprise. I literally remember the minute I invented him because I needed someone to do something very specific. I needed to kick off the rest of the plot, and this is the only spoiler I'll give. It's for chapter 3 of the first book. Mahit has gone back to her apartment. She and Three Seagrass have kind of made friends, and the plot could go absolutely anywhere from here. Like there's no driver currently. I mean, there's a dead guy and some weird rumors, but there's no push. So I needed someone to make them go look at the dead guy again, because yeah. And this is what I sometimes call like carrying the plot object. In this case, it wasn't an actual object. It was like a plot moment. So I was like, okay, so who on earth would Three Seagrass let in? Because she's not going to let in just like any rando. She's way too suspicious for that. She's not that kind of person. Who would she allow to get her into this? Okay, old grad school friend. All right, let me invent someone real fast. And then I wrote the three of them together, and they bounced off each other in this kind of amazing way. And that was a very like discovery moment for me. And then 12 Azalea became a major character in the book, and one I'm really happy about. One of the things that I love doing is trying to write people who have the absolute courage of their convictions, even if those convictions are really outside what we would normally understand as being logical. And I try to do that with every character I write. Three Seagrass is one of the more fun ones to do it with, especially in the second book, where she gets some point of view, which she does not in the first book. Because my God, is she intelligent and well-meaning and very flexible and relatively xenophilic and a complete bigot and doesn't know it. And I love playing with that because I love her. And she really is trying, but there are cultural constraints. So writing characters like that is important to me. I like showing people as being as difficult as people are, because people are really difficult and complicated.
Yeah, they just all jump right off the page, to use a term that is often used. um, yeah, and also I've sort of realized while we've been discussing the characters, about the naming convention, the Texcal naming convention, and I know some people have emailed me with questions about the naming convention, so I think that's definitely something that we should talk about.
So Texcal and Litzlim are named for a number and a noun. And I did this actually, I was inspired by the naming practices of a different Mesoamerican group than the Aztecs, from the Mixtec people, who have awesome names like One Jaguar, things like that. And that's for a day of the sort of the fortnight-ish week. And the noun part is for a day of the sacred calendar. And I thought that was really cool. I love how they sound. But I also wanted to, I was talking earlier about how the Tixkolanli Empire has this real emphasis on grandeur and richness and aesthetic beauty. And it's very physicalized in a lot of ways. And I wanted to convey a lot about the objects that people from that culture thought were important by making them name themselves after them. And then because I'm me, I built a whole set of symbology around the names. Though I have also done things like yell in my writers group chat, can someone just give me a noun of this kind, please? And I had an unpleasant moment while I was writing the cast of characters in the back of the book for this last one, where I realized I had named like 5 different people, 2 and then a word that starts with C. I don't know why I did that, but I did, and now it's confusing and I can't undo it. But I love that it draws a pretty harsh line between people who are Tixkolanli and people who aren't. You really do know in the book who is from which part of the universe. It's also fun working out rules for a naming system, because then you can break them deliberately, and the breaking them can be important. So I set up a rule for myself that the Tixkolanli noun part of the name has to be an inanimate object, a plant, or a concept, and not usually so many things that are concepts, but concepts like sunrise. They like astronomy for concepts, and architecture. And most of the objects are going to be things like tools, paper, inkwell, all that kind of stuff. But nothing that is animate under its own power. So no self-driving cars. You can have cars, but not self-driving cars. No animals. And significantly, no insects. And then I got to name a character with an insect name in the second book for very specific reasons. So one of the fun things about doing a really systematized bit of world building is that if you can, and I hope I do, get your audience to buy into the rule, when you break it, it becomes another lever to show meaning or difference. And that's really fun.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's a really interesting naming convention, and to hear where it came from is definitely really illuminating. And I think the title of A Memory Called Empire has the word memory in it. And having read it, I feel like memory in many different ways plays a big role in the book. Whether it, like whether it be sort of the cultural memory or like a literal machine in your head with someone
That
else's
gives you
memory.
the memory of the person who had your job last. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about institutional memory. So on LaSalle Station, which is Mahit's home, one of the ways that they pass down knowledge is by implanting the memory and bits of the personality of the person who did your job before you did, so that nothing that they learned is lost. And I have a neurologist friend who has assured me that this is absolutely impossible. And he is correct, and I don't care.
Good for you. My book, I'll write it how I want.
So as long as I don't break my own rules, and there are very specific rules about how imago technology works. So what I was thinking of when I came up with it was the problems that exist when people inherit a position at a company that used to be held by someone who everyone thought was essential. Like, not the kinds of things you can put in an employee manual. Because you can put things in an employee manual, and like you can teach someone a sequence, you can teach them where everything is in the office, you can even teach them who they should go talk to when X happens. But what you can't teach is all of that accumulated knowledge of how to do it well and fast, whatever the it is. And that it's why there's this horrible and hilarious concept in some corporate management manuals about the bus number. How many people need to get hit by a bus at your company for the company to go under? You really want to have a bus number higher than 1. Because if that number is 1, you have a substantive chance of being very, very screwed. So a company is one thing. A closed ecosystem surrounded by vacuum is quite another. If a company goes under, that can be awful, and people can lose their livelihoods and maybe their houses and sometimes their lives. But if the space station collapses, everybody is dead. So also, it takes humans a really long time to reach adulthood. I mean, in the scale of the spaceship is leaking, the spaceship is leaking needs to be solved within, hopefully, the next hour. Finding a new person who knows how to make the spaceship stop leaking may take somewhere between 13 and 20 years. Unless you can get that faster. What if you could? This is another one of those what ifs that came out of a sociological question for me. And it intersected really nicely with the stuff about imperialism and cultural exchange and cultural continuity that I was thinking about already. Because that's a different kind of passing down cultural knowledge. Can you operate in the culture that is the prestige culture? Can you acquire the ability to cite Homer at will? That in Byzantium was something that meant that you were erudite, that meant that you were a citizen, like a person. And that is a kind of cultural memory, and it is a kind of cultural skill. But there are other kinds, and different cultures prioritize different sorts of memory.
And one more thing about the imago machines, which I feel it's sort of explored in A Memory Called Empire, and definitely more explored in A Desolation Called Peace, is, you know, the thought of gender, which came up, and because people might have, the memories of someone with a different gender identity implanted.
I thought about this a lot. both because I wanted there to be room for really complicated gender identities in the world I was writing, and because I wanted there to be room for gender to not be very important. Because I think those things are both true for different people. Personally, I'm a cisgendered person, but I have a very strong gender identity. I would be really unhappy as a different gender. And I think probably if I existed on LaSalle Station, I would need an imago who shared my gender identity. But that's kind of an edge case. Like, not most people are kind of like, well, I have a gender, but okay, whatever. Like, it's not a big part of, for a lot of people. And for some people, it's really important. So for Mahit, it's not that important. Other points of commonality are more important for Mahit. I think Mahit probably thinks of herself as being a woman, but that's just sort of like a random flip of a coin. It certainly doesn't bother her, but it also doesn't matter. But there are people on LaSalle Station, and I mentioned them briefly in the second book because I got more space to like show stationer culture in the second book, who have much stronger gender identities and who really aren't okay with a cross-gender imago. And I wanted both. Like, gender is really significant, but not for everybody. And sometimes it's not the most important part of commonality.
It's definitely a very, very interesting exploration across both books. And so I know we've been sort of talking about A Desolation Called Peace and A Memory Called Empire at the same time, because the two, they just really go hand in hand.
They're a pair. They're supposed to. Like, it's really one story with a very clear stopping point in the middle. You could just read the first one and never read the second one, and you should be fine. I would prefer you read the second one, but
yeah, would you like to sort of give an overview of the second book in a way that's
yeah, let's see if I can do a really spoiler-free version. So at the end of A Memory Called Empire, there is a new and semi-mysterious alien threat to Tixkalan. At the beginning of A Desolation Called Peace, that alien threat is very actual and is doing things like committing planetary genocide and has to be dealt with. So if A Memory Called Empire is like a Le Carré novel, A Desolation Called Peace it's very much my playing with military science fiction, which is a genre I love, but one that I often don't find speaks to the kind of emotional valence that I'm also really interested in. So I wanted to write one that was for me a little bit. So it's set in great majority on a battlefront between this mysterious alien force that no one can figure out how to talk to and a Tixkalanli fleet of warships. Except that various things go wrong, as they do because fictional characters never get to sleep. It's their own fault for being invented. And the commander of the fleet ends up needing some first contact specialists, and by various means ends up with Three Seagrass and Mahit as first contact specialists, and things spiral out from there. There's also a plot that happens back on the Jewel of the World, the setting of A Memory Called Empire, with another character who is in book one, but not nearly so intensively. So there's a lot about what kind of orders are good orders to follow, and what it is like to be a person who's just beginning to get real agency and power, but doesn't have it yet. One of the point of view characters in A Desolation Called Peace is an 11-year-old, which was really fun to write. He is a very unusual 11-year-old, but he is definitely still 11, poor kid.
Yeah.
So it's it's got interstellar mail fraud and kittens. There are definitely kittens. I wanted space kittens, so they're in the book. There's kelp beer, which does not taste good. There's a lot of politics, and there's the problem of being really too good at your job in various ways, and sometimes having a boss who thinks that's a problem.
I particularly appreciated the space kittens, I have to say.
We love them. Like, I mean, the space kitten, like, it's deeply self-indulgent. I swear they are plot relevant. They're not just there to be cute. In fact, they're only sort of there to be cute at all. They're mostly there to be plot. But I love cats. I don't have a cat right now. I want a cat for various reasons. It's not happening in the current house I live in. So I wrote fictional space kittens, and then I inflicted them on my characters because not everybody likes cats, and some people have them anyway.
Benefits of
You
being
had me
an
at
author.
space
So let's see. A Desolation Called Peace is definitely on a larger scale than A Memory Called Empire. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's got 4 points of view instead of 1. And that's very deliberate because for in A Memory Called Empire, it's an information control novel. No one gets to know anything that Mahit doesn't figure out. But A Desolation Called Peace is a much wider novel. So it has 4 different points of view that rotate and 4 different interlocking plots. It's also about a question that is broader than the question in A Memory Called Empire, which is a question that is a very internal question from Mahit. Like, what do you do about loving something that's killing your culture, if anything? The big question in Desolation is, can you talk to the profound other at all? And that's a much bigger idea. That's something that has to do with societies, not only a single individual. I think each individual answers the question in A Memory Called Empire for themselves, but societies have to answer the question in A Desolation Called Peace. It also takes place over a much wider, like, ground, being that there's events on LaSalle Station, there's events out on the frontier, on the battlefront, and also on a desert factory planet. And there's also events back in the city, the jewel of the world. And all of those events touch each other, actually, which was why there is an interstellar mail fraud plot, because if you separate your characters and they might try to talk to each other, and it takes a while for things to get from place to place. I really enjoyed showing other parts of the universe in A Desolation Called Peace.
It was definitely, I, as a reader, enjoyed it, getting to explore the different parts of the universe in A Desolation Called Peace. All right, I think that's all I have for A Desolation Called Peace, for fear of the spoilers.
I'm trying so hard not to spoil anything, and it is really difficult, guys.
Yeah, so I think we can open it up to questions now.
So I have a couple questions from the chat. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I work at RPL with Melissa. So do you want to do those first? And if people haven't looked at the chat, I'm just going to read the questions, but there's some good comments and discussion going too. So if you want to take a look. But the very first question, I'm just going to go in order, is from Alton. And Alton wants to know, Arkady, if you consider Stephen King's books sci-fi.
Okay, yes, and So there's a literary genre fiction convention that I go to in Minneapolis called 4th Street Fantasy. And one of the tenets of 4th Street Fantasy, I swear this is relevant, is that all science fiction is actually fantasy. So we can just talk about the whole thing as being fantasy. And I tend to do this backwards. I think it's all science fiction. When you are doing something that plays with an idea, no matter whether that idea is explored through a technological type of non-realism or a magical type of non-realism, for me, that falls into the thing I think of as science fiction, though really I should call it speculative fiction. Sometimes King is more sci-fi than other times. If you look at, Under the Dome is a very science fiction-y book, and also the time travel one about the assassination of JFK, which I've forgotten the title to. Incidentally, I love Stephen King like a lot, and I think he's one of the great prose stylists of the American literary tradition. So it's an interesting question. He's certainly a speculative fiction writer in my head.
Thank you. Okay. Next question is from Tim, which is, what are you reading these days? Any genre?
Ooh, let's see. I have just gotten my hands on a secret, like just finished advanced manuscript of my good friend Elizabeth Bear's newest book, which I'm really excited about. It's called The Origin of Storms. But what I am mostly reading actually is nonfiction at the moment. And that's kind of because I've just finished this really intense period at my day job where I was working 18-hour days for about 6 weeks. So I've been reading a lot of either nonfiction that's relevant to my day job, which is, I've got one of these like next to me here. I'll grab it. And this is a really cool book. This is about power lines and landscape architecture. And it's kind of what I do for some of what I do at my day job. And I've been fascinated with that. It's called Power Lined Electricity Landscape in the American Mind by Daniel Webben, or Webben, possibly. Probably not Webben, that sounds really wrong. So I've been reading a lot of nonfiction and a lot of airport thriller stuff. Like, it is not meant to be good. It is meant to be full of horrible serial killers and drama and like upset things I can just fall into and read in 2 hours. I like airport thriller stuff when I'm really tired.
Awesome, thanks. So we have a world building question from Lauren, not me, which is there email in TextClon? It seemed like they had to drop off digital messages to be physically delivered to the recipient. Is that right?
Yes and no. There is email, but it is, if you have it in the infofiche stick, the physical message, that's way more prestigious than sending someone an email. It's also a little bit more secret because you have to open the message stick to get the message, and that breaks the seal on it, which tells you that someone read it. I mean, unless you have exactly the same sealing wax and the same seal, which you might if you were being clever. But yes, there is email. The big thing about how information travels in TextClon is that email and all other electronic communication will only work until you go through one of the jump gates, the sort of wormholes. You can't send an electronic message through, you have to physically carry it. So that's one of the constraints. Again, I like to set constraints because that makes for plot. It's how you get plot.
Awesome, thank you. And you talked a little bit about how this could be read as a standalone, but they're really two books together. But will it be a trilogy or any more, or no?
Yes. So no, it is not a trilogy. There are not
Okay.
three. There are two very deliberately. Not everything comes in threes, guys. Will there be more Tixkalan? I certainly hope so. And I, at this point, pretty much expect that there will be. I have many stories I want to tell in this universe, possibly more duologies, possibly single standalones. But these two books are the opening and closing of an arc. That does not mean I will not come back to Mahit. It just means that when and if I do, it will be from a different place with some different questions.
Awesome. Then that hit, I think, kind of two people's questions. So what were, and this is part of one of my questions too. What were the inspirations or sources for the novel's titles? Were they what you were originally planning, or did they evolve over time?
Oh God, titles are the worst. So it was certainly not the title that I wrote all of A Memory Called Empire under. That's because I never had a good title. For a while, my document was called The Perils of Mahit, which is a bad title. It sounds like a pulp novel. And I sold it under, I don't even remember anymore, some other bad title that my agent had helped me find. And then there was a long period of what I have referred to as throwing water balloons at the castle of Tor marketing, where I proposed many titles and no one liked them, including me. So I actually found the title to a desolation called Peace first. When I sold the book, I sold it as a duology, so there would be a second one. So I knew that, and I knew what it would be about and some of what would happen in it, though I hadn't written it. So I was in a bar in Prague. This is one of those moments where I'm like, oh my God, I sound like I'm fictional. I was in a bar in Prague and I was reading Tacitus again. Tacitus, the Roman historian, and Tacitus has a poem / history called the Agricola. And there's a famous quote in there where he puts this in the mouth of one of the people who've been conquered by Rome. And it's Rome makes a desert and calls it peace. And the word for desert and the word for desolation are very related, including in English. You can see it in English, but it's even more related in Greek and especially in Armenian, which is one of my favorite things. So I played with that and it just sort of was like, bang, okay, I have the thing. I have a title. And that one, I wrote it in an email to my agent and my editor and was like, well, this is the title for book 2. Do you like that one? And they were like, yeah, we like that one. Can you make a title for the first book that sounds like that one? So after a while, I figured that one out too.
Awesome, thanks. And for anyone who doesn't know, Tor is the publisher.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No. So here's a question from Ben. One of the things I was struck by in both books was some characters' choices to extend trust and grace to others at times when both culture and individual experience might advise against. A kind of radical trust. Can you talk a bit about those themes in your writing?
Oh, that's lovely. That's a really lovely way of putting it. And it's not one that I've conceptualized for myself in those words, but you're not wrong. I think that sometimes if we're especially lucky in the people we get to know and in our own selves and what we are able to do in the world, we run into moments where you kind of have to commit to radical trust. I think that people do that when they get into good relationships, in good marriages, in good business partnerships, but also just sometimes with your friends. and sometimes with people who you really never want to be friends with. And that kind of willingness to take the absurd risk that is being in a state of radical trust is one which I think is probably as close to grace as anybody really gets in this world. So anyway, not to get incredibly theological at y'all, but yeah, it's there.
Yeah, I like the term grace for that radical trust. Okay, from Jade, the themes of diaspora and colonization in memory particularly really hit home for me. Did you draw from your own experience to write these themes?
In part, yes. So I'm Jewish. I'm an American Jew, and thus assimilation is a really significant part of my understanding of my own culture and the culture that I live inside. And the ways in which my people came to America in the early 1900s. They came from Hungary and from Russia, and they landed in Cleveland and Buffalo, which is a bit weird, but you know. And like many of their compatriots, they became extremely American and very deliberately. And while still maintaining a certain sense of separation. And I was raised secular, I'm no longer secular, but I'm a weird Jew, I guess. But exploring my own connections to my culture made me think a great deal about why do people commit to assimilation? Why do people want it? What do you get? What don't you get? Because there's always a danger there. I've also been an immigrant. I've lived in countries that are not my own. I've had a very positive experience of being an immigrant because I am extremely privileged. I lived in Sweden for 3 years, and I came on a work visa, was recruited to be an immigrant, essentially. And that was a marked contrast to the experiences of many of my friends who did not have the institutional privileges that I do by virtue of my level of education, wealth, and skin color. And that contrast was very sharp for me. And at the same time, knowing that I was like so disparate from my own sense of being an American when I lived in Europe, that being an American, I wasn't like other Americans. Like what was being an American anyway? So thinking about immigration and assimilation and being attracted to culture that isn't yours is a huge part of my life. And it's also something that is an even bigger part, I think, of the lives of some people who are really close to me. And I wrote this for me, but I also wrote it to honor what I know of their experience.
Thank you. We have a question from Declan. Was there any of Gregor, and I'm not sure if I'll say this right, Vorbara, in 11 Antidote? I felt like they would have a lot to say to each other.
They would have a lot to say to each other, but no. Gregor Vorbara is a emperor character in Lois McMaster Bujold's series of books called the Vorkosigan Saga, which are great and I love them. But no, the child character in science fiction who I'm talking to is Ariane Emery II from C.J. Cherry's Cytine, if you know that book. There's a lot about clones and like being your ancestor or not in that, and also writing about kids who are too smart for their own good, and whose intelligence does not get them out of the problems of being a kid.
I thought about the chosen child in Buffy, like the first season of Buffy.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that in so long, but yeah.
From Terrence, how have current events impacted your writing, and how do you anticipate them affecting your writing and science fiction at large in the future?
That is far too big of a question
It's a
to
big
answer.
question.
But I mean, in the sense of how do current events affect my writing, it is really, really hard to write when you can't leave your house. I am a much worse writer in terms of finishing things on time than I was before the pandemic. I expect to be a better writer about finishing things on time as the pandemic eases over the next year. In terms of current events very specifically influencing my work, I'm not that interested in it. I don't like writing response fiction. And I mean, that's not to say it's not something that can be really good and really, sometimes I like reading it. But for me, I'm not a futurist. I can't tell you what is going to happen in 5 years as a science fiction writer. I might be able to tell you a little bit about it as a energy policy person, but only a little and with some big caveats. So for me, when current events impinge on my work, it's in the sense of, like what I was talking about, algorithms and policing. That is something that is incredibly significant in where America is right now. And it's something that I think about all the time. So it gets into the groundwater of what I do as a writer.
Okay, from Jason, did Anne Leckie's approach to defining her rad empire have any influence on the development of your future society?
Nope. So publishing takes a really long time. I did not read Ancillary Justice until after I had finished writing A Memory Called Empire. The hilarious and lovely thing is both Anne and I are responding to the same book, though, which is why we sometimes seem like we are talking to each other. We're both talking back to another series called Foreigner, which is written by CJ Cherry. I mention her a lot because I love her work, and has like 20 books in it. But Anne is a fantastic person and a brilliant writer, and I've had the pleasure of getting to talk to her about this. And it's really, really funny that we both love the same series and both wanted to sort of play with the same ideas. And it's convergent evolution more than anything else.
Okay, from Sarah, what were your inspirations in writing the poetry verses in A Memory Called Empire?
Ooh, so I'm not a great poet. I have written like 2 poems that are good in my life, like good enough to be published, like that I feel are good. And one of the things that I hate when I am a reader is running into poetry that to me sounds twee. So it was desperately important to me that the poetry in these books didn't throw people out of the story, which meant that I didn't want it to rhyme. I didn't want it to be metered. I kind of abstracted it out real far. And my influence most directly was actually English translations of the Japanese poet Kobayashi Issa in terms of mood and feeling, which they're really nature focused, they're hyper visual, but because they're translations, at least the translations that I've read, they pull away from the formal characteristics of the poetry to try to preserve the emotional valence. So that was kind of what I used as an inspiration.
I love that. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Eitan. Is there a placeholder name in TextClon like Jane Doe in American English?
There should be. I don't know what it is, but there should be, which means there is one, and I'll have to think of it now.
Let's see. Getting close to. From Casey, I saw your tour after hours talk last night, and as such, favorite Leverage episode.
all of them. No, that's not fair. The Rashomon job, which is a episode in which the same story gets told 5 times from the points of view of 5 different characters, in which more knowledge of what actually happens gets tacked on as you layer it over and over and over again. It's also incredibly funny, and uses the talents of the actors to their utmost. I adore that episode.
Positive feedback in the chat regarding that answer. That's what we've got in the chat so far. Melissa, I'm gonna go back to you.
So we have time probably for a couple more questions. If anyone wants to verbally shout out a question, you're welcome to at this time.
Hi, this is Sarah speaking. Thank you so much. I have to say that my father, who was on this chat tonight, who had to leave, turned me on to your novels. He is a PhD in city planning and a sci-fi enthusiast. So your comments meant a lot to both of us. We've been texting each other. What was it about city planning that you think help you in terms of world building? And why did you decide to leave academia and go back to this very city planning, energy resource type work position?
God, there's a lot of answers to that. I think, so I love what I did as an academic, and I still do some of it, but I had run into the problem of there being no tenure track jobs. I had multiple academic book contracts and international speaking gigs, but no one would hire me and pay me a living wage at the same time. And it was heartbreaking. And while that was happening, because I'd had this amazing postdoc in Sweden and had written this book, written a memory called Empire, and like most of an academic book. They're kind of about the same thing. And I was having this, I don't know where I'm going next. I can pick up everything again. I can leave everything again and like move to Hong Kong or Vienna for 9 months, because I had a couple of those really short-term gigs. And at the same time, I had met the woman who's now my wife, Vivian, and really didn't want to live on the other side of an ocean from her anymore. That was an unpleasant year. 6 hours time difference is workable if you are willing to stay up really late and get up really early to get to talk to each other. And I screwed up my circadian rhythm really badly by flying back and forth from Baltimore to Stockholm. So there was a pull and also a push. And there was another push, which was actually the 2016 election. And it's not a direct, like, Donald Trump was elected, so I quit academia and went to work for cities, but it was sort of looking for something that I could do, that I was suited to do as much as I was suited to do academia, that would feel like I had my hands on the wheel a little bit, because it was very distressing for me, existentially distressing. And urban planning and cities have always been incredibly important. I grew up in New York, like I said, and I love cities as organisms, as places to be. And I remember writing in a journal entry, I want to build cities that won't drown. And then I just sort of did it. This is the horrible trick of me. I just do things because they might work. This one did. And I'm happy I did it. And I mean, I miss academia in a lot of ways, but I love the work I do. It's important, it's fascinating, it makes my fiction better. My fiction makes me better at doing government policy too. So it's worked out in the end.
Thank you.
Do you have time for one more question?
There's a couple more chat questions, so I'll read the first one that came in after from Terrence. Did you choose writing as a career, or did writing choose you?
Well, I certainly didn't choose it. I mean, I think as a kid, I thought, oh, well, I shall be a writer because I'd written some small things like a lot of kids do and had gotten praise for them. And I mean, what kid doesn't like being praised for things? But I rapidly discovered that writing anything good required work, and that would not do. I'm bad at practicing. It's also why I'm not a concert pianist. Writing ended up being something that I decided to do professionally because I wanted to talk to my favorite authors and have them take me seriously, which is the worst reason to become a professional writer, but it was mine. It was oh, I have to get really good and I have to be on the same level as these people I admire, so that if I come up to them and I say, I want to talk about your characterization choices in chapter 8, and whether you're making a reference to this other book, that they look at me like, oh, cool, my colleague has noticed a neat thing, not, dear God, please get this fan away from me. So I decided to get good enough. And yeah, I don't know, it's the worst reason. It's worked out though. I remember very distinctly the moment my mother asked me point blank, are you planning on quitting academia to write science fiction? And I was like, no.
Yes, you are.
No, I'm not. And
Yes, you
that's not
are.
why I quit academia, actually. I assumed that I would quit academia. I would write science fiction and do academia. And it turns out instead I will write science fiction and do policy work, but you know, so it goes.
Right. Well, I think that's all that we have time for this evening. Arkady, thank you so much for talking science fiction, A Memory Called Empire, and A Desolation Called Peace tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
So it's very enjoyable, and I hope that you have a good rest of your sort of book birthday time with your new
It's been
book.
pretty good so far.
And thank you everyone for coming and for bringing lots of awesome questions. And we will put this recording up on the Reading Public Library YouTube page so that any and all may refer back to it at a later date. All right.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Bye.